Welcome. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Henry Giroux, a world-renowned educator, author, and public intellectual who currently holds a McMaster University Professor for Scholarship in the Public Interest and is a distinguished visiting professor at Ryerson University. He's also the Paulo Freire Distinguished Scholar in Critical Pedagogy and writes regularly for Truthout, where his latest article is Downplaying Trumpism is Dangerous. His most recent books include American Nightmare, Facing the Challenges of Fascism, Against the Terror of Neoliberalism, Disposable Futures, Violence in the Age of Spectacle, America at War with Itself, and his latest book, just out, is Race, Politics, and Pandemic Pedagogy, Education in a Time of Crisis. Welcome to Background Briefing, Henry Giroux.
Thank you, Ian. It's always good to be on.
Well, thanks for joining us. And I take it that your new book makes the case that the crisis with Trump and his second impeachment, and whether or not the House will be able to make a sufficient case against him to get the Republicans to join in impeaching him, that's very much in doubt. But the point, I take it from what you've written in your new book, is that the real crisis in America reflected by Trump and his recent assault on the Capitol and on American democracy itself, the crisis in America is a crisis of education.
Absolutely. Actually, what I'm trying to say in the book is that it's difficult to separate the crisis of education from the crisis of politics and basically the crisis of democracy. I think that when we make that separation, we fall into a terrible error, a terrible mistake. And one mistake that we see emerging out of people who don't take that context seriously, or those set of associations, is they kind of get lost in the moment. So that when we talk about Marjorie Taylor, or we talk about QAnon, we sort of focus in on the most bizarre kinds of episodes, and talk about people who are kind of out of their minds, or are crazy, or anomalies. And in doing that, we have no understanding of how to reframe this issue in a way that would speak to a drift in the United States towards fascism, hard-right authoritarianism, and particularly in the Republican Party, but also what the underlying conditions might be that give rise to these people, and the crucial role that education plays in developing the kind of collective consciousness that not only normalizes this stuff and operates off the assumption that it's okay to sort of, to be a white supremacist and to put one in the White House, but to vote for somebody who basically has the blood of 100,000 deaths on his hands before he left office. I mean, this is not just about willful ignorance. This is about the inability to think critically and rationally. It's about the failure of educational institutions to do that. That didn't begin with Trump. They began basically with Reagan. And also about the inability to understand that the most powerful educational forces that we have at work today are in the culture. The larger culture, whether we're talking about the mainstream media, or whether we're talking about the digital media, we're talking about the internet. These are all very, very powerful tools for shaping agency, shaping particular kinds of identities, and mobilizing the kind of resentments that people have in ways that turn them into anti-Semites, turn them into racists, and lead them to believe that democracy really doesn't work and that there's no point in fighting for it, as opposed to fighting against it.
Well, you said 100,000. It's 500,000.
No, I meant before he left office. I mean, at that point, there was a point where it's around 100 or 200,000, or 150,000, where people were saying he could have actually avoided this if he had done a mask mandate, a national federal mandate, instituted it as law. 150,000 lives could have been saved. But in the long run, you're absolutely right. He's responsible for clearly a much greater number than that, as we're seeing in the existing figures.
And of course, the debate today on the House to strip Marjorie Taylor Greene, the QAnon congresswoman, of her seat on the Education Committee, of all things. In many ways, the punditry is missing the point. It's not so much about QAnon and about, it's absolutely unacceptable and reprehensible that she's threatening the lives of her colleagues in Congress. But the point, again, is that the reason that McCarthy and the Republicans are defending her is because their base believe the same kind of craziness, and that gets back to the ill education in this country. And as Trump said on the stump in 2016, I love the poorly educated.
Yeah, I think that what we're talking about here is we're talking about a party that basically prides itself on its anti-intellectualism. We're talking about conservative cultural apparatuses such as Fox News that reproduce that kind of ignorance daily, whether it's about the virus or any range of other issues. And we're talking about basically politicians who further legitimate that form of ignorance, which is, to put it more bluntly, which is really quite lethal. And I think that when you have a party, you have a cultural apparatus, you have media foundations, you have right-wing academic foundations like the Heritage Foundation, destroying the nation's civic fabric and doing everything it can to basically undermine the most basic tenets of democracy because they understand something. And what they understand is you can't have a democracy without informed citizens. And it's very clear, particularly for the Republican Party, but the Democrats are not exactly free of this charge either, is that thinking is dangerous in the United States. I mean, particularly the kind of thinking that indicts capitalism, the kind of thinking that says that the market should not be the template for all to define every aspect of social life, and that self-interest shouldn't be the central organizing principle of American society. I mean, and I think that when we fail to talk about this, we reinforce what I would call a crisis of consciousness, which is really a crisis of education, tied very, very carefully to the production of particular modes of collective consciousness that are very dangerous, racist, militant, refusing to see the government as an agency of social responsibility, anti-Semitic. It goes on and on. I mean, and this is a crisis of education that has implications not simply for classrooms, but also for boardrooms, for living rooms, for corporations, for the way teaching is sort of exercised in a variety of cultural apparatuses. If we're going to have a healthy democracy, you can't live in a society that claims that there's no such thing as truth or evidence, or a society that claims that shared values no longer matter. It doesn't work that way. And it seems to me that when you do that, you're setting the groundwork intellectually for a legitimation crisis, a political crisis that opens the door for fascism.
So little wonder, I guess, that Trump's stormtroopers who attacked the Capitol and desecrated it and defecated on the floor, one of their targets, their prime targets, apart from lynching the vice president and assassinating the speaker, was to get AOC.
Well,
she was hiding in the bathroom of a colleague's office, terrified. She could hear the marauders outside saying, "Find her. Where is she? Find her."
Well, I think that one of the things that we have to recognize here, which is very crucial to the arguments that you're making, is that, remember, one of the central tenets of fascism is you have a society divided basically in ways in which you have friends and enemies. And this is a call for a minority government of people who share, in this case, certain fascistic values. And when they talk about enemies, they're not just talking about people who are dissidents. They're not just talking about disagreements. They're talking about people who need to be killed. They're talking about people who need to be done away with. When Marjorie, so to speak, says that, supports a tweet that says Nancy Pelosi should be shot, it's pretty clear that violence becomes a central and legitimating tool of power for these people. It's not just an abstraction. And they really do want to do away with almost anyone who basically doesn't fall into their understanding of what the public sphere is. And this is a public sphere for them that excludes black people, excludes brown people, excludes Jewish people, excludes people from the southern border. In other words, it's a public sphere that basically is occupied by a concept of white nationalism and white supremacy. And I think we have to ask ourselves, where have we seen this before? And this ties in with a very central question about education. When you don't have a country that in any way supports a robust notion of historical inquiry and historical, it seems to me, consciousness, and you have a society that says, everybody who lives in that society is really responsible alone for the problems that they face, not only do you have a form of historical amnesia, you have a form of social amnesia. And what I mean by that is people, because of this rabid individualism at work in American society, they have no way of translating private issues into larger systemic considerations. That's a form of depoliticization. And I think that what we see in the United States is a country swamped in what I would call the mechanisms of disimagination machines. They undermine the capacity to think. They undermine the capacity to be rational. They overplay the emotional quotient. They overplay the spectacle. They overplay the performance. And in doing so, they basically depoliticize people, and they lead people to believe in the need for strongmen and simplistic answers, which is the basis for fascism.
And again, I'm speaking with Henry Giroux, a world-renowned educator, author, and public intellectual who currently holds a McMaster University Professor for Scholarship in the Public Interest and is a distinguished visiting professor at Ryerson University. He's also the Paulo Freire Distinguished Scholar in Critical Pedagogy and writes regularly for Truthout, where his latest article is Downplaying Trumpism is Dangerous. His most recent books include American Nightmare, Facing the Challenges of Fascism, and his latest book, just out, is Race, Politics, and Pandemic Pedagogy, Education in a Time of Crisis. And you write, impeaching Trump is a step forward in holding him accountable, but he did not act alone. The broader forces aligned with his ongoing acts of violence, cruelty, and lawlessness must also be held accountable, and this must include the crimes of Wall Street, the right-wing extremist media conglomerates who lied about the election, and the financial elite who provided the funds for Trump's political and cultural workstations in denial, diversion, and falsehoods. And of course, you have to add to that list, I guess, Trump's GOP, the ones that are coming to the defense of Marjorie Taylor Greenes. They gave her standing ovations last night.
I think it's a crime to really suggest that the only thing at work here that is dangerous regarding Trumpism is the social base. I think that's part of a politics of diversion. Marjorie Taylor Greene really is a much more important person, it seems to me, to focus on as somebody who's symptomatic of a much deeper sort of political rot, a rot that's not only political but educational, that sort of prides itself on its own willful ignorance. And I think the Republican Party is the Republican Party is a party of authoritarianism. It's a minority party, minority of a base party, meaning that it believes in rule by minorities. It doesn't believe any longer that democracy matters, that we should have fair elections. It engages in voter suppression and all kinds of tactics to reinforce and consolidate its own power at the expense of both the vast majority of the American people and at the expense of democratic values. And I think that we need to figure out a way to begin to both expose these people and what they believe in, but also to hold them accountable. I think that one of the things that we learned from the Obama administration, remember, you and I are old enough to know that Obama allowed, these torturers, people who kidnap people and put them in black sites, transported them illegally to Guantanamo, tortured them, engaged in all kinds of illegal spying, they got off with impunity. And I think the message, the educational pedagogical message there is very clear, that if you have power, you're above the law. If you have power, you don't have to be held accountable. And I think with the assault on the Capitol, the way in which that sort of political and moral act of irresponsibility, not holding people accountable, begins to come to the surface, is that it accumulates and it gains momentum until you see what we are now seeing now. And that is the possibility for large outbreaks of violence across the United States, people who are basically arming themselves, claiming they're in a war with the government, people who are threatening politicians, people storming the Capitol. These are not unlike the thugs that we saw in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, and they certainly in some ways are part of the same kind of anti-Semitic, racist kind of notion of racial purity and racial cleansing that we saw then. They may not mimic it entirely, but if we don't link what they're doing to history, if we don't become more educational and conscious critically about what's going on, we not only not learn the lessons of history, we repeat them, not as a farce, but as truly a tragedy.
And you mention also in your article at Truthout, a lot of the writers that I've interviewed recently, Sarah Churchwell, Timothy Snyder, and Jason Stanley,
Sure.
and they argue, of course, that the Trump regime has consistently embraced the long-standing and malignant traditions of American fascism. So
I think Ian, this is a really fabulous question because, I'm doing a lot of work on this. I know all these people, not personally, but I love their work. I love especially Timothy's work. And Sarah Churchill wrote one of the best pieces on the case for fascist politics in the United States that I've ever read. But I think that one of the things that we see academics and liberals doing consistently is this absolute refusal to employ any notion of fascism on the ground that if it doesn't imitate entirely and completely what we saw in Nazi Germany, that there's nothing to be learned. Well, I'm going to say something. That's an act of complicity. That's not just bad scholarship. I mean, it seems to me that fascism operates in relatively various forms, and by not acknowledging that, and to claim that simply because it's not repeated identically, it somehow exists outside of history and exists outside of the possibility of reoccurring in different forms, strikes me as absolutely insane. And I remember, actually, I know we've all read this stuff. Adorno said something interesting. He said once, if you really want to understand fascism, you better study capitalism quite clearly. And he also said at another time, that the social conditions for fascism never go away. They always continue to exist. But that sometimes they exist in ways that are not so visible. Sometimes they exist in ways that really are like punching you in the face. And when they're punching you in the face and you don't see that, and you can't recognize it, and you can't analyze it, and you can't come to grips with its implications are, you're not just being stupid, you're being complicitous. And so it seems to me that the level of accountability goes a long way in raising questions about this kind of politics of diversion and what its relationship actually is among liberals to a form of Trumpism that parades in diversion. It's a very, how do you say this, dangerous road, to say the least. And that's why education is so crucial.
And again, I'm speaking with Henry Giroux, whose brand new book just out is Race, Politics, and Pandemic Pedagogy, Education in a Time of Crisis. And this is the most important book, as we have been discussing so far, that the real crisis in America, among all of the crises of COVID, economic freefall, and the fascist attempt to take over the Capitol and destroy American democracy and install a wannabe dictator, as bad as all those are, at the heart of it, as Henry is arguing, this is all a result of the paucity of education, critical thinking, and this alternative universe of alternative facts that has been propagated by Fox News and others in what some are calling post-truth America. But let me just quote what you've written here. We have a Nazi problem in this country. Some 73 million people voted for it. They don't, for the most part, wave swastikas and salute Hitler. But we have a Nazi problem in this country as deeply as the German people had a Nazi problem in the 1930s. Their minds waterlogged with conspiracy theories. They take lies as truth, spread hate and bigotry, wrap themselves in several flags, American, Confederate, Blue Lives Matter, and use the Bible as a weapon of violence and repression. They are a grotesque expression of the worst of this country, of its ugly narcissism, its thuggish militarism, its ignorance. They carry the torch of slavery, genocide, and Jim Crow terror. Gunned up and maskless, they exalt, above all, the right to kill.
That's a quote, actually, I use in my piece, I believe. But there's nothing in it that I don't support.
Well, you've nailed it. I mean, it's just terrifying, and it's so real. So what is the antidote?
Now, can we just qualify that in one way? You know, and you've done it so brilliantly so many times because you're always so articulate. But it seems to me that, you know, we talk about the economic crisis and the political crisis and the medical crisis. But one of the things that we often overlook is that maybe the most powerful influence that Trump had, deeply rooted in a whole range of historical, economic, and political forces, Ian, is the way he changed the political culture. He normalized racism. He normalized white supremacy. He normalized cruelty. He normalized the most savage elements of neoliberal capitalism. He normalized the system that deals in death. And he basically did that with a kind of arrogance that would suggest that he wore it like a badge of honor. And it seems to me, until we can break through and understand that, until we can make power visible, until we can talk about putting in place a different language for people to both resonate with and to be able to become more critical about the conditions that bear down on their lives, until we start talking about institutions, public and higher education, that are a public good and are not just simply mediums to get people jobs in the global economy, until we stop talking about schooling as simply for testing, until we stop talking about teachers as if they have no rights and have no power and have no insight and have no intellect. I mean, until we stop doing this stuff and change the language and all of a sudden rise to the occasion where we have a real vision accompanied by a language and accompanied by a set of emotional investments in which people can recognize themselves, I think we're in trouble.
And as Henry has written, Trumpism is a worldview that defines culture as a battleground of losers and winners, a world in which everything is rigged against whites. This is a world in which unity disappears into Trump's right-wing assault on the public good and truth, as reality itself dissolves into a right-wing propaganda machine in which politics becomes the plot to steal from whites their natural due as Americans. Trumpism defines power as immunity from the law, and that the most admirable representatives of power are those who are triumphant and innocent in the face of every accusation of incapacity, criminality, and unethical conduct. How else to explain Trump's pardonings of grifters, political cronies, and war criminals? It is truly, it's extraordinary how low we've sunk here. And how are we going to crawl back, Henry? I don't want to reinforce the despair.
I want to end on this point of despair, as you don't. And I want to say this. Look, with George Floyd, with the rise of young people in this country who are fighting back, with the rise of teachers who are walking out of schools that have become dead zones of the imagination, with people who are defending in some way the lives of the incarcerated who are being subjected to the most horrendous medical abuse by not being vaccinated, to the women in this country and men who are poor, who are struggling every day to simply feed their kids and get adequate medical attention. It seems to be a new spirit of both humanity and resistance growing in this country. People realize that capitalism and democracy are not the same thing, and that we need new political parties, new political formations, we need new educational institutions, and we need, among other things, we need to amplify the alternative media like you do. We need to speak more directly to what the problems are. We need to educate journalists not to live in the dreary world of balance, but to seize upon the truth and take responsibility for what they say in order to speak to the public and not to defend people who have power. And it seems to me there's a movement of that happening, unlike anything I've ever seen before. And I'm older than Lincoln. So it seems to me that, yes, there are moments here. There's a moment of critique, but there's also a moment of possibility.
Well, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you, Ian. It's always a pleasure, and thank you for inviting me on.
And again, I've been speaking with Henry Giroux, the world-renowned educator, author, and public intellectual who currently holds a McMaster University Professor for Scholarship in the Public Interest and is a distinguished visiting professor at Ryerson University. He's also the Paulo Freire a distinguished scholar in critical pedagogy and writes regularly for Truthout, where his latest article is Downplaying Trumpism is Dangerous. His most recent books include American Nightmare, Facing the Challenge of Fascism. His latest book just out is Race, Politics, and Pandemic Pedagogy, Education in a Time of Crisis. This has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters. I'd like to thank producer Graham Fitzgibbon, and this program is available for podcasting at backgroundbriefing.org, where you can sign up for our email updates as well as subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you like this program, you can help us reach more listeners by taking a moment to rate and review us on iTunes, Google Play, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please do share the program with friends and family and colleagues on Twitter and Facebook. And to help us sustain our mission and spread the word to keep us corporate-free and commercial-free, we have added a donate button. So if you're in a position to give support, please take a moment to visit backgroundbriefing.org/donate where your tax-deductible contributions will help us continue to build a reality-based community in post-truth America. And I'll be back again tomorrow with another background briefing. Bye for now.
Standing along the side of the pickup truck, a shot rang out in the night, just when everything seemed right. Another headline written down in America. The guy that lived next door in 305 took the kids to the park and disappeared by 9:30. Who'll ever know how much she loved them so? That dark night alone in America. A quiet voice singing something to me, an angel song about the home of the brave in this land here of the free. One time, one night in America. Four small boys playing ball in the parking lot. A preacher, a teacher, and the other became a cop. A car skidded into the rain, making the last little one to say, one more light goes out in America. A young girl tosses a coin in the wishing well. She hopes for a heaven, while for her there's just this hell. She gave away a life to become somebody's wife. Another wish unanswered in America. People having so much faith die too soon, well, all the rest are made. We write a song that sunlight plays upon my window pane. I wake up to a world that's still the same. My father said to be strong, that a good man can never do wrong. In a dream I had last night in America. A wise man was telling stories to me about the places he had been to and the things that he had seen. A quiet voice was singing something to me, an angel song about the home of the brave in this land here of the free. One time, one night